Blue Water Divers over there on Broadway at about 6th Street. They're having a sale on the 6th. I think it's the 6th tomorrow.
Today's Saturday.
Friday.
Today's the 4th.
Today's the 4th? Okay. Yeah.
Been in school 1 month, guys. Been in school 1 month.
1 month, hey, congratulations. Still here. So what we're going to talk about this morning is cell and tissue injury. You know, a little histology here. If you exclude the nervous system and the skeletal muscles, and then all other cells of the body fit into one of these two categories here. One of them would be an epithelial cell, which is not only going to be your skin, but all the cells lining your respiratory tree, your digestive system, your genital system. All organs are constructed this way. All of the endocrine organs are constructed this way. The thing about the epithelial type cells is they have they rest on a basement membrane, as we've seen in the first day when we started talking about skin. That gives the cell polarity. There's a basal part to the cell and an apical part to the cell. If you look at a thyroid cell, for example, iodine enters through an active energy requiring process against a steep electrical and concentration gradient, enters the cell from the basal surface, travels through the cell, and exits the cell through the apical surface. So epithelial cells, I mean, the point of that is that they have polarity. So the other cell type, though, that you see right here would be the mesenchymal cells, which is the mesoderm. So you've got the epithelial cells, like the lining of the gut. You've got the muscular components. I guess the gut's not a good example. The skin would be a better example. The muscle deep to it. In between them, you have the mesenchyme and full of mesenchymal cells. The predominant cell type here being the fibroblast. These little suckers, they don't have polarity. They're sort of mobile, and they are responsible for secreting the extracellular matrix, which would include things like collagen and elastin fibers. So when we're talking about injury or disease, you have to understand that when you say you have disease, it's not disease of you, it's disease of cells. Cell injury is what causes disease. It's not organ disease, it's not you disease, it's cellular disease. And the first cell type that encounters a lot of things from your environment are going to be the epithelial cells that carry the brunt of a lot of that disease, especially from the environment. Like viruses, chemicals, the crap you breathe, the crap you eat, and so on. Okay? There's a difference between, when you look at tissues, there are two terms you need to know. One of them is the parenchyma. When you hear somebody refer to the lung parenchyma or the parenchyma of the liver or whatever, that's the parenchyma is essentially the functional unit of that structure. So the parenchyma of the liver would be the hepatocytes. The parenchyma, in this case, of a lymph node would be lymphocytes, which are the red things. The stroma is the scaffolding of the structure. And almost all structures have a scaffolding to them. The scaffolding here of a lymph node is the blue stuff. These are made of reticular cells. They're called reticular cells. They create the firmness of a lymph node. The liver has a scaffold. Everything has a scaffold. When you look at a lymph node like this, this is not just an exercise knowing the difference between parenchyma and stroma. When you have Hodgkin's lymphoma, which is probably the most common type of lymphoma, it involves actually not lymph nodes, not lymphocytes, but the stromal cells. The stromal cells are called reticular cells. They come together and form giant cells. These giant cells are called Reed-Sternberg cells. Reed, R-E-E-D hyphen Sternberg. The presence of Reed-Sternberg cells, which is made up of stromal cells, on a biopsy of a swollen lymph node is pathognomonic for Hodgkin's lymphoma. Non-Hodgkin's lymphoma can occur from either the reticular cells that don't form these Reed-Sternberg cells or the lymphocytes. So the bottom line to that is Reed-Sternberg cells, multinucleated giant cells, stroma, reticular cells. Very high rate of cure, by the way, both Hodgkin's and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. All right, so cells generally function to be happy. You know, they want to stay happy. Fortunately, they have developed the mechanisms that despite the environment that they're in, they tend to stay along a steady state. You know, you can walk outside and it's 25 degrees and your body adjusts to maintain that steady state, which would include your internal temperature of 98.2. Did you know that they revised that? You know, 98.6 was what was normal, right? The midpoint of normal. That came from a German study back in the 1800s. It was actually wrong. The average, the midpoint average of the human body temperature is 98.2. So, in case you're on Jeopardy. I wish someone would be on Jeopardy. All the years I've been saying that, no one has ever been on Jeopardy. I wish someone would be on Jeopardy.
Why don't you go? Yeah.
No, I could just see myself, oh, I just make up stuff. All right, anyway. You know, I'm sure you've all had cell biology to some extent. But just a real quick primer here. First of all, you have a cell membrane. You do not have a cell wall. Microorganisms have cell walls. You don't. You have a cell membrane. Within the cell itself, probably the most significant structure is the nucleus, which is going to carry your DNA and other significant proteins. Around the nucleus is the rough endoplasmic reticulum. This is a series of sacs with ribosomes attached to them. The ribosomes transcribe proteins into the RER for use, for export by the cell. So in cells that have a huge export of proteins, like for example, beta cells that produce insulin. Insulin is a protein. You have a very rich RER. If you're going to export proteins, you need to package them in granules that can be exocytosed. The little package factory here is the Golgi apparatus, which receives the product from the RER, packages it into granules, and sends it towards the apex of the cell, where it's discharged either into the circulation or into the local environment, like an islet, where you would find beta cells, or into a follicle if you're going to store the product, like the thyroid gland. Over on the other side here, you'll see the smooth endoplasmic reticulum. Smooth ER contains a series of enzymes located on its membrane. Those enzymes are responsible for converting cholesterol into other lipid-related substances like cortisol, your sex hormones, aldosterone. All of these things are derived from cholesterol, and it's the smooth endoplasmic reticulum that does part of that work. The other part of that work comes from enzymes on the membranes of the mitochondria. So to process cholesterol into, say, cortisol, some of the enzymes are located in the mitochondria, some in the SER. The intermediate compounds get shifted back and forth until you wind up with the finished product. Because they're lipid soluble, they don't need to be packaged. They just diffuse through the membrane and go about their way. Any questions about that? Lovely. So there are other elements here. The mitochondria, wonderful little structure that contains its own nucleic acids that you know that all the mitochondria in your body came from your mother. Not one mitochondria in your body came from your dad. A little spermatode injected its DNA into the egg. The mitochondria that were in the sperm that got it through those miles of seminiferous tubules and reed testes and efferent ductules and all the way up to vas deferens, they stayed outside. So the eggs, mitochondria, were the only ones that you had. So that's why, I mean, it's really amazing that, you know, you can determine lineages based on maternal lineages based on ribosomal DNA studies. And that's how most of the significant work in terms of how humans migrated across the planet 60,000 years ago and more came from mitochondrial DNA studies. It's really interesting because if you take somebody, you know, there was a study on Discovery Channel one time where they went and did mitochondrial DNA analysis, everybody in a town. And then they had this map of the world, and then they would say that there were, I'm kind of making some of this stuff up. I don't remember it clearly, but there were like 7 Eves. So they can trace mitochondrial DNA back to 7 theoretical Eves. One would be in Africa, one would be in Siberia, one would be in Europe, you know. So they would test your DNA and could determine that you that the majority of your mitochondrial DNA came from this Eve. And it was really interesting because, you know, you're blonde-haired and fair-skinned, but yet your ancestry goes back to sub-Saharan Africa. Or you could have somebody that was really black, and then they would be European. And it was really interesting. I can't remember the name of this, but it was really impressive. Do you remember it?
I don't know, but I watched a show once where they were like doing they were making babies out of 3 sets of DNA. Like they were doing the sperm, the egg, and then they were doing mitochondrial DNA to make a baby. It was really weird.
Well, that's odd.
Yeah.
All right.
But can do stuff like that.
Well, I kind of lost our way there, my way there. There's other organelles that you're going to find in the cell. Lysosomes and peroxisomes are granules containing different enzymes for digestion. Lysosomes contain larger enzymes that break down used cellular elements or break down stuff that the cell might eat. Peroxisomes typically contain hydrogen peroxide that break down lipid type stuff locally. all cells have a cytoskeleton that's used to maintain its structure. In the case of neurons, the cytoskeleton is used to transport synaptic vesicles from the nucleus to the axon terminal. So it's very important, the cytoskeleton. There's a centriole here that's basically a tool used in division, cell division. Otherwise, it's not really that functional. The flagellum, there are not many flagella in your body other than sperm. You do have lots of cells, though, with not flagella, but different types of processes on the this apical surface, like philia. Instead of a big one flagellum, there would be folds of the membrane, plasma membrane, to form hair-like structures that increase the cell's surface for various reasons. Like in your GI tract, you want this because you want to have more exposure to nutrients going by. As a matter of fact, the digestion of some sugars, the enzyme for that is located on the membrane, so you are able to use that enzyme to make the conversion so that you can uptake the glucose molecules. There's a drug called let's see, it's an alpha glucosidase inhibitor that blocks that enzyme that decreases your ability to absorb glucose, and it's used in the treatment of diabetes. Acarbose is the name of the drug, acarbose, alpha glucosidase inhibitor. Boy, pull that one out of my butt. Okay, there are other types of philia that actually move in a organized pattern. These are located in a lot of hollow organs, like your trachea. You have a cilia that are constantly beating like this, moving mucus up. So the particles from the environment, the garbage you breathe if you live in Chicago or New York, is constantly being moved by this ciliary escalator to get, so you swallow it. You will never forget that because of that. The other thing is when you ovulate an egg inside your oviduct, there are philia inside of there that will propel the egg along. So there are a lot of places in your body where that's, the philia are important. All right, so let's talk about injury, because that's really what we're talking about. Yes, ma'am?
Can it be philia or cilia?
Cilia, yeah.
Yeah.
You can say cilia.
Okay. Well, you said both, so I was like, is it?
Ciliated epithelium is the way to go with it.
Okay.
I kind of said philia because I got hung up on the flagellum.
Okay.
Ciliated.
Okay.
And there are different types of cilia. There's a low cilia that's actually called, they're called microcilia, and they don't wave. It's the long ones that do, that are used for propulsion. Okay, so injury. Now, you've got the homeostasis going on over here. There are different types of injury. A mild injury is something that can be reversed. If it's acute, the insult goes away and it's not too extensive, you can recover from it. And that dip can go all the way down here in some tissues. Adaptation, we'll talk about later on, is there's a change in the milieu and your cells have to adjust to it and function accordingly. Once you dip below that irreversible line, though, that's the point of no return, you're going to have cell death, and there you go. You know, an example of this would be progressing renal failure. You have a progressive loss of glomeruli, and you're looking at the function of the kidney, it's a progression over time. Parkinson's disease is the same way. You have a slow progression, loss of cells in the brainstem until finally there's irreversible injury and outward symptoms related to it. Here it is in tabular form. It's the same type of process as before. The one thing I want to add to this is once you get down here to irreversible injury, you're usually going to wind up with necrosis of the cells, of the tissues, or apoptosis is a programmed cell death. It's a suicide mechanism. That the cells realize that they're not coming back, they're not going to be able to recover, and they program themselves to die. Thankfully, you have this mechanism because when you deal with a lot of DNA damage and you have a cell that is could become a neoplasm, these cells can activate a suicide mechanism and they kill themselves before they become a tumor. I'll go over this more next week, but that process of suicide by cells is called apoptosis. And it goes on in you every day. So.
Any example of cells that do that?
Let's see. When you were a fetus, you had millions of eggs. By the time you were born, you had a few 100,000. What happened to those other eggs? They died. They committed suicide. The ovary underwent apoptosis in terms of the cells. It's the same way with neurons in the brain. You start out with gazillions, you lose a whole bunch of them before you're born, and there you go. Another example, talking about eggs, happens every month. Every month, you switch ovaries. This month it's going to be the right ovary, next month it's going to be the left ovary with what you ovulate. Every month, your ovaries say, okay, you 12 are going to develop from this resting phase into a mature follicle for ovulation. U12, right here. So you take the initial steps to become a mature follicle. You can see it histologically. But then all of a sudden, right there at the end, right before ovulation, 11 of you die. It's only one of you that's chosen to ovulate. Why is that? Why did you 11 die? Why did you hit the suicide button and you didn't? And then next month, it happens over there and then over. It's the oddest thing. I don't know. Adaptation, I guess I hit the button, didn't I? Adaptation here, if we focus on that for a little bit, adaptation can be either way. It can be adapting at a lesser ability to function. For example, if you wind up with glomerulonephritis and you're able to recover from it, but your kidney is damaged, the cells of your kidney are damaged, your kidney function is less, creating an elevation in a thing called creatinine, or your glomerular filtration rate, remember that in physiology, goes down. Your kidney is not functioning to the normal level, but it's still functioning. Your body has adapted to it. Versus somebody or cells where the adaptation is actually enhanced. One of the examples of this would be if you take a liver and look at the hepatocytes at the smooth endoplasmic reticulum in hepatocytes, and they have a big smooth endoplasmic reticulum. If you give that person phenobarbital, which is metabolized through the smooth endoplasmic reticulum, suddenly the hepatocytes upregulate the amount of smooth endoplasmic reticulum they have. So if you look at this cell, before the phenobarbital, it has, let's say, 10 smooth endoplasmic reticulum. You look at it post taking phenobarbital, it's got 100. So it has gone from being able to metabolize phenobarbital to this level to an enhanced level. The other one is a thing I added last night, is that anybody here get seasick? Anybody here ever been seasick? It is the most miserable experience of your life because you keep throwing up and you can't stop throwing up until you hit dry land. It is horrible. I get seasick like crazy. Every year growing up in North Carolina, my dad and I would go deep sea fishing. And as soon as we got outside of land, I'd start throwing up. I tried everything in the world, Dramamine, eating breakfast, not eating breakfast. I heard that if you put an Irish potato in your pocket, you wouldn't get seasick. There's an Irish potato in the Atlantic Ocean now because I got seasick, so I threw it in the Atlantic Ocean. Anyway, and I get seasick. We went on a cruise. Big ass ship, no motion. For some reason, I get seasick on a 5-day cruise. Not a good thing. I will never go on a cruise again. All right? There are several reasons I wouldn't go on a cruise again, but that was the main one. So, back in the 80s, they invented a drug called scopolamine. That actually has been around for a long time. It's used to treat nausea in pregnancy. Anyway, they put it in a little patch that you stick behind your ear. Called transderm scop. That's what it used to be called. I don't know what it's called now. Worked great. I put one of those things on the night before. It's an anticholinergic. It blocks the cholinergic sense neurotransmission, and you don't get seasick. Greatest thing in the world. Went seasick. Went deep sea fishing. I don't know how many times. Never got seasick. So one day I went out with this guy. We went deep sea fishing. Caught a lot of fish. And got back, and I took the patch off, right? The next day, he called me and said, hey, you want to go out tomorrow? And I said, yeah. You leave the patch on, right? And I said, okay, yeah, we'll go. So that night, I put another patch on, right? So we go out seasick and go see deep sea fishing the next day. I got seasick the entire 8 hours we were out. Why? Because when I put that first patch on, the neurons that the scopolamine was active against, and in the elements of my inner ear, they have receptors for scopolamine. So when I put that patch on there, the cells recognize all your receptors are full. You need to upregulate the number of your receptors. The next day when I took the patch, that night when I got in, I took the patch off. The scopolamine dose went down, but the next day, the receptor numbers were still up. I put the patch back on. I was only able to get my scopolamine level up to here. When I went out deep sea fishing, I've got all these extra receptors. I got seasick. That's an example of adaptation, an enhanced adaptation. So if I had left the scopolamine patch on the whole time, or put a new one on every day, I wouldn't have gotten seasick. So, cellular adaptations, you need to know these different types here. What do these mean? Obviously, you've got a decrease in size, an increase in size, increase in number. Metaplasia is a substitution of cell type. So if you see here, you've got cuboid cells here, and these metaplastic cells are over here. I'll talk more about metaplasia here in a minute, what it means. And then finally, dysplasia means the substitution of the normal cell for abnormal cells. Metaplasia is the transition to dysplasia, essentially. I'll give you some examples here. Atrophy, loss of cells. It can be physiologic or pathologic. Physiologic would be something like aging, and I'll give you some other physiologic examples. Pathologic could be this Perry-Romberg syndrome here. It's an oddest syndrome. It's the loss of the subcutaneous tissues, the muscle, the bone, everything, in half of the face. It's exactly half of the face. You see this little kid right here? Over here, the subcutaneous tissue is gone. The lip is starting to come up on that side. It's as it progresses, there's no cure for it. As it progresses, it gets pretty deforming. So this little girl, sad. Now, atrophy can either be a decrease in the size or the number of cells. The number of cells would be in this syndrome. The size would be an example of that would be if you, well, I'll tell you in just a second. I'll tell you right now. All skeletal muscle has to be innervated. I think I've said that before. All skeletal muscle has to have a nerve synapsing on it at a neuromuscular junction. If you cut the nerve supply to the muscle, then what happens is growth factors that the nerve excreted to the muscle go away, and the muscle will atrophy. So they will decrease in size. If you ever look at a paraplegic person and they're sitting there in a wheelchair, look at the diameter, and they've been a paraplegic for years, look at the diameter of their legs. They will be the same diameter as their arms. They're very thin. That's for two reasons. One is it's loss of the innervation. No, excuse me, I back up. Let me back up. The decrease in size of a paraplegic is disuse atrophy. It's still innervated. If you cut the spinal cord, the muscle is still innervated, right? Because you still have the reflex arc. It's still innervated. If you cut the nerve or damage the nerve to the muscle, you're going to get denervation atrophy. So there are two types of atrophy that you can relate to this right here. Decrease in size would be disuse. Or denervation. Decrease in the number of cells would be like in the syndrome here. Anybody ever had a cast on their arm? You know, that thing's been on 6 to 8 weeks. You take the cast off, and that arm is noticeably smaller than the other. That's a disuse atrophy. Here is atrophic muscle in the thenar eminence. We talked about Lou Gehrig's disease. You also see this in untreated carpal tunnel syndrome because the median nerve, remember the median recurrent supplies the thenar eminence. Oh crap, are we supposed to memorize that? Yes, you got to, forever. That's why in carpal tunnel syndrome, if you suspect carpal tunnel syndrome, you need to look at the thenar eminence.
Is that a sign of MS too?
Multiple sclerosis is a demyelinating disease, so it is a denervation type of muscle atrophy. Yes. Muscular dystrophy, the most common type of muscular dystrophy is called Duchenne's, D-U-C-H-E-N-N-E, Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. It is an X-linked genetic disorder passed down from the mother. Usually affects kids in their early years, like sort of begins around 2 years old, 1 to 2 years old. It's a progressive loss of muscle cells or replacement of muscle cells by fat. They become weakened and they usually die early. The characteristic picture of a kid, a boy, and they're almost always boys because of the X-linked nature, if they're sitting on the floor, when they get up, they have to roll over and use their arms to stand up like that. They can't use the weakness of the legs. They can't stand up on their own. Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. There are dozens of types muscular dystrophy, but they all have the same type of pathology, or, they result in sort of the same outcome, at least at the growth level. Any questions about muscular dystrophy? It's a very common disorder, not curable. Atrophic atrophy, here in this case, it was due to a decrease in blood flow over time. This is a chronic issue, not acute. If it was acute, it would die because of, it would be smaller because of gangrene. But here it's a slow progression loss, and it was decreased in size over time. Conversely, hypertrophy is the expanded size of cells. You don't increase numbers with hypertrophy. There are certain cells in the body where you can't increase the number. That would be primarily the nervous system and the skeletal striated muscles do not divide. You can't replace them. Here's physiologic. This guy is obviously done some physiologic weightlifting and steroid injecting. By the way, that what artery is that right there? What vein is that? Excuse me.
Cephalic.
This is cephalic, yeah, okay. What muscle forms those ripples?
Serratus anterior.
What?
Serratus anterior.
Serratus anterior. All right. So that's physiologic. This is pathologic here. Against increasing resistance, like atherosclerosis or obesity or any number of reasons, the left ventricular muscle mass increases in trying to reach that level of homeostasis and produce an effective cardiac output. Left ventricular hypertrophy is what you try to avoid when you're treating hypertension and atherosclerotic heart disease, atherosclerosis. Cardiac muscle hypertrophy, I got rid of the two panels on the bottom because I didn't really add anything to this slide. You see the enlarged cells, and the nuclei of the myocytes, cardiac myocytes, enlarges and becomes cuboid shaped versus the spindle shape that you see in the regular cardiac cells. I call boxcar nuclei. Here's a physiologic example. Here's the normal size uterus here, and here's the uterus that was removed after parturition. So the baby came out, and then because of postpartum bleeding, they had to go in and do an emergency hysterectomy. Here's the thing, the most common cause of postpartum bleeding is uterine atony. In other words, after you have a baby, the oxytocin that's released causes your uterus to contract. You have a surge of oxytocin. So the uterus will go from this size to this size within just a matter of minutes. And of course, the purpose of that, after the delivery of the placenta, right? So you deliver the baby, and maybe 5 to 10 minutes later, they'll deliver the placenta. Can be more or less time, but the placenta's delivered. Once the placenta comes out, it weighs almost as much as the baby. The uterus will contract because of a surge in oxytocin. Matter of fact, if you have a line in and they start bleeding because of atony, in other words, the uterus is flaccid, it does not contract, then what you want to do is bolus them with oxytocin to make it contract. But when this thing was taken out, obviously they hadn't figured that out yet, and they went and removed the uterus before she bled out. The most common cause of postpartum hemorrhage is uterine atony. That will be on a board question somewhere. I can promise you that.
Is that out?
Yes.
Is that apnea like APNE or acne like?
A-T, without tone. A-T-O-N.
Oh, you said acne.
Yeah, that's what I thought too.
I was like,
Acne, no, not acne. A tone, without tone. A is without tone. Acne.
ATONY.
Doesn't sound.
okay,
A Tony.
okay. Hey, jeez. Hey, Tony.
You're bleeding. Okay. And you see over here histologically, the difference in the size of the myocytes, quite remarkable. These are smooth muscle cells, obviously. It's not striated skeletal muscle or cardiac muscle. There are three types of muscle histologically: smooth, cardiac, and striated. So this would be part of the smooth muscle. Any questions about this?
How is the hypertrophy?
It's just the size. The hypertrophy is the size before delivery. And the amazing thing, I mean, truly the amazing thing to me is how much, anybody ever pushed on a uterus after anybody's had a baby? Yeah, a couple of you. One of the things is, I don't know if they still do it, this was back in the Stone Age when I was a student, that after the baby came out and after the placenta came out, which by the way, the placenta is a whole lot more interesting than the baby. It truly is. You need to massage the uterus to stimulate it to contract. And when you push on a immediate postpartum uterus, it has the consistency of pushing on a solid steel trailer hitch. It's about that size. Am I being serious? And it is steel. It is not like pushing on a, your nose or something. It is like pushing on solid steel. It's truly impressive. Truly impressive. Any questions? Any other questions? Did I answer your question okay? Yeah, it's, the hypertrophy is what happens to get you to the third trimester, get you to the end of 9 months. Okay. If it doesn't contract, it's still hypertrophic.
Will you give us a list of all these board questions, or we need to keep tab of it every time you go along?
There's books for that.
Yeah, I would just keep writing these down. Yeah, so by the time you leave here, you'll have all the board questions down. I wrote board questions for 14 years, so most of them are mine anyway. This is a...
Is that from your Halloween decorations?
What's that?
Is that from your Halloween decorations in your house? I'm being
Yeah,
serious.
my wife goes a little crazy about Halloween. This is the normal thyroid here. The thyroid is really the only endocrine organ that stores product to any significant degree. And so it creates thyroid hormone, and I'm saying this simplistically, and I'll give you more detail when we get to the endocrine system, but it stores it in these follicles. So when you need it, these cells retrieve the hormone and process it and secrete it out through their basal components into the capillaries here, okay? So this is the normal thyroid. There is a disorder called Graves' disease. Interesting, most of the diseases of the thyroid are immune-mediated. So you actually produce autoantibodies to the thyroid, or the TSH receptor. TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, is produced by the pituitary. TSH travels down to the thyroid, where it binds on a TSH receptor, and that induces the release of thyroid hormone. In Graves' disease, you produce this immunoglobulin that binds to the receptor and stays bound to the receptor. So it's overstimulating the thyroid. So you're pushing out way too much thyroid hormone. Now ordinarily, this is a negative feedback loop. The more thyroid hormone you would have, you turn off TSH. But that doesn't happen in Graves' disease. You've got these autoantibodies that are constantly stimulating the thyroid. It becomes hyperplastic. If you go back to the original definitions here, hyperplasia increases cell number. So in this person here, because the thyroid is increasing in cell number, you actually see it as an enlarged thyroid in the neck. That's called a goiter. It's hyperplastic. The bulging eyeballs is one symptom of Graves' disease. Of course, you treat it now and you don't get it to this level, but it's actually it's not due to the presence of thyroid hormone. Graves' disease, you actually get a bunch of lymphocytes deposited in the fat, the retrobulbar fat. Remember when we did the eyeball? It was loaded with fat in there. You get tons of lymphocytes invading that fat, and they actually push the eyeball out, or protrude the eyeball like that. If you treat Graves' disease early enough, the exophthalmos is what this is called. Exophthalmos, protruding eyeballs, versus endophthalmos, which is like your eyeball sucked up in your head. If you treat it early enough, the exophthalmos will go away. In this person, even if you remove the thyroid gland, she's still going to have these buggy eyeballs. Okay? Any other questions? You can tell she's like a Victorian era, maybe 1800s or something. This is a same type of thing happens in the prostate gland as you age, and I think I've mentioned this before, benign prostatic hyperplasia. Some people refer to it as hypertrophy, but it's really hyperplasia because you have an increase in cell number. The size of the prostate increases, and you can see in this enlarged illustration here how it's putting pressure on the urethra right there, the prostatic urethra. They say actually that a man's life is divided into thirds. The first third is you acquire your education. The second third, you spend it acquiring your wealth. The third third, you spend it trying to pee. So that's the third, Jamie, I'll explain it again. If you live long enough, you will have BPH. It just happens. Okay. Hypoplasia is when things just don't develop like they're supposed to. This is what my wife's kidneys, these are not my wife's kidneys, but this is what's going on with her. She has a hypoplastic kidney on one side. She actually only has one functioning kidney. Hypoplasia can come in several forms. This is when the epidermis fails to develop. There's no epidermis on this infant. It's going to die if it's not dead already. Aplasia cutis is usually involves aplasia of a spot in the scalp. You'll see it in an infant, that there'll be a spot where the scalp is absent, and it takes years to grow in. Not years, it takes a long time before it grows back in. But in this particular case, none of the epidermis developed. Metaplasia is, this is the interesting one. So what you got going on here is because of constant and chronic irritation by some chemical or mechanical trauma, the cells change. Now, you can think of, if you started playing the guitar, you would develop calluses on the end of your fingers. If you started rowing, you develop calluses on your hands here. That's not metaplasia, because the cell type is still keratinocytes. That's it. This is different. This is changing the histology of the tissues. One of the best examples of this is in a chronic smoker or a chronic alcoholic. At the base of the esophagus, just before it enters the stomach, you see metaplasia occur. This happens mostly in alcoholics. And you don't even have to be an alcoholic. If you just drink to excess without being a full-blown alcoholic, you can wind up with metaplasia of the distal esophagus. That's called, I believe I've said it before, that's called a Barrett's esophagus. That's metaplasia. The problem with Barrett's esophagus, though, if you stop drinking, the tissues will turn back to normal. If you don't stop drinking, you run the risk of metaplasia becoming dysplasia, which can be a neoplasia. Steve?
Could you give an example of mechanical? Could you give an example of mechanical that was chemical?
Mechanical would be, let's see here. Those who dip snuff or chew their inside of their cheek. That's a mechanical, the presence of the tobacco or the constant chewing will produce, if you look in the cheek, the normal mucosa is replaced by a whitish line. That's metaplasia. The same thing with people who dip snuff. The initial changes in the oral cavity is metaplasia. If you don't stop, you're headed towards bad news.
What about transition zone in the cervix? Would that be metaplasia?
No, that's going to be dysplasia. Let's talk about that for a second. Dysplasia is the substitution of the normal epithelium by cells that are definitely changed. They're changed not only in, they're not cervical anymore. They're a unique cell type that has an accelerated rate of division. They don't produce the same substances as cervical epithelial cells. They're different. Dysplasia is the next step from dysplasia is neoplasia, which is new growth, which is a tumor. Now, fortunately, it was found out that the cervix, when you get an abnormal pap smear and you see these cervical cells that are undergoing change, they're dysplastic. It used to be that you did pretty serious things to get rid of them. You did conization, you cauterized them, you froze them, all sorts of things. You had to get rid of them. But it turns out that if you wait, most of these things, most abnormal pap smears, at least the minimally abnormal ones, in 6 months will go back to normal by themselves without doing anything. So you can recover from dysplasia. Some people don't, and it will progress to cervical cancer. One of the triggers for dysplasia, obviously in the cervix, is infection with human papillomavirus, HPV. Why don't you take a break and then we'll come back.